The air inside the gilded plate smelled of expensive truffle oil and arrogance, a heavy scent that usually signaled a long, exhausting shift for Julian. He adjusted his bow tie in the reflection of a polished brass pillar, trying to ignore the way his lower back throbbed after 10 hours on his feet. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but the image of his daughter, Lily, pale and resting in a sterile hospital bed, kept him moving. He smoothed out his white dress shirt, which was thinning at the elbows from years of scrubbing, and stepped back into the dining room with a practiced, polite smile. Julian knew his place in a room like this. He was the invisible man, the ghost in a black vest who made sure the wine was chilled and the water glasses were never empty. He was used to the occasional cold shoulder or the diners who spoke over him as if he were part of the furniture, but he always maintained his dignity. He had to. Lily's life depended on every dollar he could scrape together from the tips of people who didn't know his name. The heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant swung open with a force that demanded attention. Marcus walked in, not just entering the room, but colonizing it. He was draped in a charcoal-colored pinstripe suit that cost more than Julian made in a year, his silk tie shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. Beside him, his assistant, Sarah, scurried to keep up, her eyes glued to a tablet as she rattled off a list of merger details. Marcus didn't look at the hostess. He simply pointed toward the most prominent booth in the center of the room. He moved with the terrifying confidence of a man who had forgotten what the word no sounded like. Julian felt a strange, cold shiver crawl up his spine as he watched the man approach. There was something in the way Marcus tilted his head, a specific rhythm to his stride that felt like a ghost from a dream Julian couldn't quite remember. Julian approached the table, his voice steady and professional. He welcomed them to the restaurant, his hand reaching out to offer the leather-bound menus. Before he could speak a full sentence, Marcus held up a hand, palm flat, silencing him without even looking up from his phone. The silence stretched, thick and insulting, as Marcus finished a text. Finally, Marcus looked up, but his eyes didn't meet Julian's. Instead, they raked over Julian's frayed sleeves and the small, stubborn scuff on his left shoe. A slow, mocking smirk spread across the CEO's face, a look of pure, concentrated condescension. He didn't see a human being, he saw a failure. With a deliberate, slow motion, Marcus took his heavy linen napkin and crumpled it into a ball. He stared directly into Julian's eyes as he let it drop, watching it hit the floor near Julian's feet. Marcus leaned back, his expensive watch catching the light, and let out a dry, sharp laugh. He told Julian that since he seemed so comfortable standing in the shadows, he might as well get used to being on the ground. He demanded Julian pick it up, his voice loud enough to make the neighboring tables turn and stare. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her face flushing a deep red as she whispered for Marcus to take it easy, but he ignored her. He was enjoying the power trip, the simple, cruel pleasure of making someone else feel small. Julian felt the heat rising in his neck. He looked down at the napkin and then back at the man in the suit. Up close, the resemblance was becoming haunting. He saw a small, jagged birthmark on Marcus's wrist, a mark he had seen 1,000 times in a dusty foster home decades ago. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the boy he had shared his bread with, the boy he had taken a beating for so he could have a chance at a better life. But as Marcus sneered, calling him a slow, pathetic servant who probably couldn't even read the menu he was holding, Julian realized the little boy was gone. In his place stood a man who used his success as a weapon to wound the very kind of person who had once saved him. The tension escalated when Julian reached for the wine bottle to fulfill the drink order. As he poured the vintage red, Marcus made a loud, sweeping comment to the room about how some people were born to lead corporations while others were biologically wired to serve bread. His tone was sharp, dripping with an entitled, American swagger that suggested he owned the air Julian breathed. When Julian's hand trembled slightly, just a fraction of an inch, Marcus saw his opening. He snatched his water glass and, with a flick of his wrist, poured the ice-cold water directly onto Julian's shoes. He barked for the manager, claiming that the clumsy idiot had ruined his mood. Julian stood there, his socks soaking wet, his pride being shredded in front of a room full of the city's elite, looking into the eyes of a brother who didn't even recognize his own blood. The cold water soaking into Julian's shoes in the present dissolved into the memory of a different kind of cold, the biting, damp chill of a Chicago winter 25 years ago. Back then, the world didn't smell like truffle oil. It smelled of wet concrete, industrial floor cleaner, and the stale scent of cheap cereal. Julian was 16, his coat 3 sizes too small, standing in the dim hallway of a dilapidated foster home. Beside him, trembling so hard his teeth rattled, was 8-year-old Marcus. They weren't brothers by blood, but in a house where the radiators hissed more than they heated, they were brothers by survival. Julian remembered the weight of Marcus's small hand gripping his sleeve, the boy's eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. The memory sharpened as a group of older boys, the house bullies, cornered them in the kitchen. They had found a stash of electronics stolen from a local shop, a desperate, foolish attempt by Marcus to find something to sell so they could buy actual winter boots. When the front door slammed and the foster father, a man with a voice like gravel and a belt that left marks for weeks, came storming in, the room went silent. The foster father held up the stolen goods, his face turning a purplish hue of rage, demanding to know which of them was the thief. Marcus looked like he was about to faint, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. Julian saw the future flashing before them. If Marcus got caught, his record would be stained forever, his dream of the private tech academy scholarship vanishing into the gray walls of a juvenile detention center. Without a second thought, Julian stepped forward. The light tasted like copper in his mouth, but he spoke it clearly, claiming the theft was his and his alone. He watched the light of hope flicker back into Marcus's eyes even as the foster father's heavy hand landed across his own jaw. That night, as Julian packed his few belongings into a trash bag to be hauled away to a lockdown facility, Marcus sat on the edge of the sagging bunk bed, tears streaming down his face. He grabbed Julian's arm, his thumb brushing against the birthmark on Julian's wrist, and made a sobbing, desperate promise. He told Julian that he would study harder than anyone, that he would become someone powerful, and that as soon as he made it, he would come back. He promised that Julian would never have to worry about money or a place to sleep ever again. But as the years turned into decades, the letters Julian sent from the detention center went unanswered. The phone calls were blocked. Marcus had been adopted by a family from a different world, a world of private jets and polo matches, and he had decided that the easiest way to climb the ladder was to cut the rungs below him. He changed his last name, scrubbed his social media of any trace of his charity case past, and adopted a philosophy of ruthless meritocracy. He convinced himself that he wasn't lucky or helped, but that he was simply better than everyone else. He looked at people like the man he was now humiliating and saw only weakness, forgetting that his own strength was built on the sacrifice of a brother he had left behind in the cold. The transition back to the present was jarring, the bright lights of the restaurant stinging Julian's eyes. He looked at the man in the charcoal suit, the man who was currently laughing with a table of strangers about the help being incompetent. The birthmark on Marcus's wrist was still there, unchanged by time or wealth, but the boy who had made that promise was gone, buried under layers of silk and ego. Julian felt a profound heaviness in his chest, a grief not for himself, but for the soul Marcus had traded away to get to the top. As Marcus leaned forward to deliver one more stinging insult, Julian didn't feel anger. He felt a quiet, icy clarity. The debt of the past was being called in, and Marcus had no idea how much it was going to cost him. The silence following the spilled water was more deafening than the clinking of silverware and the low hum of jazz in the background. Marcus didn't just look angry, he looked disgusted, as if a cockroach had crawled onto his silk lapel. He didn't reach for a napkin to dry himself. Instead, he pulled out his phone, his thumb tapping the screen with a predatory rhythm. He began recording, the lens aimed directly at Julian's face, which was frozen in a mask of shock and suppressed pain. Marcus began to narrate for his followers, his voice projecting with a practiced, corporate authority. He told the camera that this was exactly why the country was falling apart, because of lazy, incompetent bottom feeders, who didn't respect the people who paid their salaries. He demanded that Julian apologize, not just to him, but to the camera, to the world, for being a failure at his one simple job. The restaurant manager, a man named Mr. Henderson whose spine seemed to dissolve whenever a black centurion card was placed on a table, came scurrying over. He didn't ask Julian for his side of the story. He didn't look at the puddle of water on Julian's shoes. He simply bowed his head toward Marcus, his voice trembling with a desperate need to please. He told Marcus that this was completely unacceptable and that the help would be dealt with immediately. To Julian's horror, Henderson leaned in and hissed that if he didn't get on his knees and beg for Mr. Sterling's forgiveness right now, he wouldn't just be fired, he would be blacklisted from every establishment in the city. Julian felt the eyes of the entire room pressing in on him. He saw Mrs. Gable at the next table, a woman who draped herself in pearls and fake piety, scoffing and nodding her head in agreement. She whispered loudly about how these people always had a chip on their shoulders. In a moment of soul-crushing humiliation, Julian felt the weight of Lily's hospital bills crushing his spirit. He thought of the medicine she needed, the surgery that was only weeks away, and the terrifying reality of a zero-balance bank account. His knees hit the hard, cold marble floor. The sound was dull, but it echoed like a gunshot in his mind. As he whispered an apology to the man he had once protected from the world, he heard the mocking click of Marcus's tongue. Marcus laughed, a cold, empty sound, and told the camera that humility looks good on the lower class. With a final, dismissive wave, Marcus told Henderson to get this trash out of his sight before he decided to sue the restaurant for emotional distress. Within 10 minutes, Julian was standing in the alleyway behind the restaurant. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, the sound of the lock clicking into place final and absolute. Henderson had tossed Julian's worn canvas backpack into the grease-stained gutter. The rain began to fall then, a cold, gray Chicago drizzle that soaked through Julian's thin shirt in seconds. He was alone. No one had stood up for him. The other waiters had looked away, terrified for their own jobs. He sat down on a damp crate, his head in his hands, feeling the true weight of isolation. He had lost his income, his dignity, and his daughter's only hope, all because a boy he once called brother wanted to feel like a king for 20 minutes. Just as the darkness felt like it would swallow him whole, a shadow fell across the pavement. Julian looked up, expecting security to move him along, but instead, he saw Sarah, Marcus's assistant. She was standing there in the rain, her expensive heels ruined by the oily puddles. She didn't say much. Her face was a mask of quiet conflict, the expression of someone who had witnessed a crime but was too afraid to scream. She reached out and handed Julian her umbrella, her hand trembling slightly. She whispered that she had seen the whole thing, that she knew Marcus had tripped him on purpose. She couldn't give him his job back, and she couldn't give him money without Marcus finding out, but she looked at him with a shred of human decency that almost broke Julian more than the insults had. She hurried back inside before she was missed, leaving Julian in the rain with nothing but a borrowed umbrella and a heart that was slowly turning from charcoal to flint. He wasn't just a victim anymore. As he stared at the back door of the restaurant, Julian realized that Marcus hadn't just fired a waiter, he had awakened a man who knew every single one of his secrets. The cold rain continued to lash against the brick walls of the alley, but Julian didn't feel the chill anymore. He sat on that damp crate, clutching the backpack that contained the wreckage of his life, but his eyes were fixed on a small, battered manila folder peeking out from the side pocket. For months, he had been a ghost, a man pretending to be nothing so he could see everything. He had spent his nights in the dim light of a hospital waiting room, not just praying for Lily, but meticulously documenting the paper trail of sterling tech. He had seen the discrepancies in the public filings, the missing millions that supposedly went to charity, but ended up in offshore accounts that bore the signature of a man who thought he had deleted his past. Julian wasn't just a waiter who had lost his job, he was the primary whistleblower in a federal investigation that had been missing its final, smoking gun. As he reached into his bag, his fingers brushed against a heavy, encrypted tablet. He pulled it out, the glow of the screen reflecting in his tired eyes. He hadn't been waiting for Marcus to recognize him out of love, he had been waiting for Marcus to slip up out of arrogance. And Marcus had delivered. The video Marcus had posted to LinkedIn, the one meant to humiliate Julian, was currently trending. Julian watched it with a grim, tight-lipped smile. Marcus was so focused on the servant at his feet that he hadn't realized the camera captured a clear, high-definition reflection of his private laptop screen sitting open on the table. In that reflection, visible for only 3 seconds, was a series of internal transfer codes and a digital signature that proved Marcus was systematically draining the Sterling family trust. A trust that didn't belong to him alone. Julian's breath hitched as he opened a scanned document from 20 years ago. It was a legal codicil from the wealthy family that had adopted Marcus. They had been good people, people who had wanted to find the brave older brother Marcus had spoken of. Before they passed away, they had left a significant portion of their estate to be held in trust for Julian, as a thank you for protecting their son in the foster system. But Marcus had lied. He had told the executors that Julian was dead, killed in a prison fight years ago. He had stolen Julian's identity, his inheritance, and his future, using that blood money to build the very empire he now used to look down on the world. The transformation in Julian was instantaneous. The slump in his shoulders vanished, replaced by a spine of tempered steel. He didn't look like a victim anymore, he looked like a predator. He realized that his silence hadn't been a sign of weakness, but a gathering of resources. He stood up, letting Sarah's umbrella fall to the side. He didn't need to hide from the rain anymore. He pulled out a sleek, modern smartphone from a hidden compartment in his bag, a device far too expensive for a waiter, and dialed a number he had kept in his contacts for 6 months. When the voice on the other end answered, Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Division, Julian didn't hesitate. "This is Julian Sterling," he said, his voice dropping an octave, ringing with an authority that would have made Marcus's blood run cold. "I have the digital signature you need." The CEO of Sterling Tech didn't just commit fraud, he just broadcast the evidence to 5 million people on social media. "It's time to move." He hung up and began walking out of the alley, leaving the rags of his waiter persona behind. He wasn't going to fight Marcus with his fists, and he wasn't going to beg for his job back. He was going to walk into the heart of Marcus's world and take back every single thing that had been stolen from him. As he turned the corner toward a waiting black sedan that had just pulled up to the curb, Julian realized that Marcus's greatest mistake wasn't mocking a waiter. His mistake was forgetting that the man who taught him how to survive was the only man who knew exactly how to break him. The game of master and servant was over. The long game had just begun. While Julian moved through the city like a silent shadow, Marcus was basking in the artificial sun of his own ego. Inside the glass-walled penthouse of Sterling Tech, the air was thick with the scent of overpriced scotch and the self-congratulatory laughter of men who believed they were untouchable. Marcus stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city lights as if they were jewels in his personal crown. He was scrolling through his LinkedIn feed, watching the view count climb on the video of Julian kneeling at his feet. Each like was a hit of dopamine, a confirmation that he had successfully scrubbed away the last trace of his gutter-born past. He turned to his board members, swirling his drink, and joked about how he had done the city a favor by taking out the trash at the restaurant. To Marcus, the world was a simple hierarchy, and he was finally at the top, looking down on the people he used to be. But underneath the floorboards of his empire, the foundation was beginning to rot. Julian spent his days in a nondescript office building 3 blocks away, a place where the air was cold and the only sound was the rhythmic tapping of keys. He wasn't wearing a waiter's vest anymore. He was draped in a tailored charcoal sweater, his eyes sharp and focused as he coordinated with a team of forensic accountants. They weren't just looking for mistakes, they were setting a snare. Julian watched the digital ticker of Sterling Tech's stock price. Every few hours, he would authorize the purchase of another block of shares through a series of anonymous shell companies. He was moving slowly, quietly, ensuring that by the time Marcus realized there was a new majority shareholder, it would be far too late to fight back. The process was a slow, meticulous grind. Julian spent hours on the phone with legal teams, his voice calm and resonant, a far cry from the timid apologies he had offered in the restaurant. He was documenting every instance of Marcus's corporate malfeasance, from the discriminatory firing practices to the offshore accounts used to bypass the family trust. There was a quiet, cold satisfaction in the work. It wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. He was taking back the name Marcus had dragged through the mud and the resources that were meant to help people, not feed one man's vanity. Between meetings, Julian would visit the hospital, sitting by Lily's bed and showing her the progress. He didn't tell her he was a billionaire in waiting, he just told her that justice was coming, and that soon, they would never have to worry about a bill again. Back at the corporate office, subtle cracks began to show in Marcus's perfect world. Sarah, his assistant, moved through the halls like a double agent. She was the one feeding Julian the private calendar invites, the secret board meeting minutes, and the password-protected ledgers. Marcus, blinded by his own hubris, didn't even notice her lingering a second too long at his desk. He was too busy planning his Entrepreneur of the Year gala, obsessed with the guest list and the lighting, unaware that his private emails were being read by the very man he had splashed with water. Every time Marcus insulted a staff member or snapped his fingers at a subordinate, Sarah would send a timestamped note to Julian's legal team. The trash Marcus thought he had thrown away was currently building a mountain of evidence that would bury him. The climax of the preparation came when Julian met with a weathered, elderly woman in a small, tidy apartment on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Higgins had been their foster mother decades ago, the only person who had ever shown them a glimmer of kindness. She wept when she saw Julian, her hand trembling as she touched his face. She confirmed the one piece of evidence Julian needed most, the original, handwritten letter from the Sterling family, expressing their desire to find Julian and bring him into the fold. Marcus had intercepted that letter and burned it, or so he thought. Mrs. Higgins had kept a photocopy, a silent insurance policy against the boy she knew had a heart of stone. With that paper in his hand, Julian knew the trap was complete. The villain was celebrating his victory in a palace of glass, never realizing that the man who had built the glass was about to throw the first stone. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Plaza was a shimmering sea of glass, gold, and ego. It was the night of the Entrepreneur of the Year gala, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the hum of self-importance. Marcus moved through the crowd like a king surveying his subjects, his chest puffed out under a tuxedo that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He held a glass of vintage champagne, laughing loudly at the jokes of city council members and tech moguls. He felt untouchable. This was his coronation, the final proof that he had escaped the gutter and climbed to the very peak of the mountain. At his side, Mrs. Gable, the woman from the restaurant, was practically purring as she patted his arm, telling him how delightful it was to see such a civilized man in charge of so much influence. Marcus took the stage, the spotlight finding him instantly. He began his speech, talking about grit and meritocracy, weaving a fairy tale about how he had built Sterling Tech from nothing but his own sheer genius. He even made a subtle, mocking joke about a certain, incompetent waiter he had encountered recently, using it as an example of why the world needed leaders like him to maintain order. The room erupted in polite, wealthy laughter. Marcus smirked, his eyes scanning the crowd for more adoration, but then the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. The laughter died down, replaced by a confused murmur that rippled through the audience like a wave. A man stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing a waiter's vest or a rain-soaked shirt. He was dressed in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, his posture radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. Julian walked down the center aisle with a slow, deliberate pace that made the security guards hesitate. He didn't look like a victim, he looked like the owner of the building. Marcus's face went through a rapid series of transformations, confusion, recognition, and then a deep, burning rage. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with a sneer that echoed through the silent hall. He demanded to know how a failed server had managed to sneak past the velvet ropes. He called for security, his voice rising in an entitled, American snarl, telling the guards to throw this trash back into the gutter where it belongs. Mrs. Gable gasped, clutching her pearls and shouting that it was an absolute disgrace for such a person to be present at an invitation-only event. Julian didn't stop until he reached the very front of the stage. He looked up at Marcus, not with anger, but with a cold, piercing pity. He didn't raise his voice, but in the sudden vacuum of silence, everyone heard him. He told Marcus that it was funny he mentioned invitations, considering Julian was the one who had technically paid for the champagne everyone was drinking. The board members at the front tables began to whisper frantically, checking their phones as news alerts started to pop up. Alerts about a sudden, massive shift in Sterling Tech's majority ownership. Marcus laughed, a desperate, hollow sound. He told Julian he was delusional, that he was nothing more than a ghost from a past he had rightfully buried. He pointed a trembling finger at the door, screaming that Julian had no power here, no name, and no future. But Julian simply reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek, black remote. With a single click, the massive digital screens behind Marcus, the ones displaying the Sterling Tech logo, shuddered and changed. The room gasped as a grainy, black and white photo appeared. It was two boys, one white and one black, sitting on a sagging porch in Chicago, their arms around each other's shoulders. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus froze, the color slowly beginning to drain from his lips as he realized that the clean negative space of his carefully curated life was about to be filled with the truth. Julian stepped up onto the stage, encroaching on Marcus's physical space until they were inches apart. The predator had finally found the trap, and the man he had mocked was the one holding the key. The digital screens behind Marcus flickered, the grainy image of the two Foster brothers looming over the gala like a judgment from the heavens. Marcus stood frozen at the podium, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O. The confident, booming voice that had just been lecturing the crowd on meritocracy had vanished, replaced by a frantic, rattling breath. Julian stepped onto the stage, the heavy thud of his Italian leather shoes echoing through the sound system. He didn't look like the man who had knelt on a restaurant floor 3 days ago, he looked like a force of nature. He walked straight up to Marcus, who flinched as if expecting a blow, but Julian simply reached out and adjusted Marcus's crooked silk tie with a terrifying, surgical calmness. Julian took the microphone from Marcus's limp hand. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that filled every corner of the ballroom. He told the stunned audience to look closely at the screen. He explained that the self-made billionaire standing before them had built his empire on a foundation of theft, lies, and a cold-blooded betrayal of the only person who had ever loved him. He revealed that the Sterling Family Trust, the very money that fueled this company, was never meant for Marcus alone. It was legally mandated to be shared with the brother who had taken a prison sentence to protect him. Julian pulled a set of legal documents from his jacket, snapping them open so the front row board members could see the federal seal. He announced that as of 4 o'clock that afternoon, Marcus had been stripped of his title for embezzlement, identity theft, and gross moral turpitude. The room erupted into a chaotic frenzy of whispers and camera flashes. Marcus finally found his voice, but it was high-pitched and desperate, a far cry from his usual corporate baritone. He screamed that Julian was lying, that he was just a disgruntled waiter looking for a payday. He turned to the security guards, his eyes bulging as he ordered them to take Julian down. But the guards didn't move toward Julian. Instead, 2 men in dark suits from the back of the room, federal agents, began walking down the center aisle. Marcus's face turned a sickly, ash-gray color. He looked toward Mrs. Gable, his Karen ally, but she had already retreated into the shadows, her face a mask of horror as she tried to distance herself from the sinking ship. Julian leaned in close to Marcus, his voice a cold whisper that the microphone still caught for the entire room to hear. He told Marcus that the napkin he had dropped on the floor at the restaurant wasn't the only thing Julian had picked up. He had picked up every crumb of evidence, every deleted email, and every stolen dollar Marcus thought he had hidden. Julian pulled back his own sleeve, revealing the matching scar from the Foster home fire. He told Marcus that he would have given him everything, all the money, all the success, if Marcus had just been the man he promised to be. But Marcus had chosen to be a bully instead. The killing blow came not with a fist, but with a single sentence. Julian turned back to the audience and announced that Sterling Tech was being rebranded as the Brotherhood Foundation, and that its first act would be to pay for the medical procedures of every child currently on the waiting list at the city's public hospital, starting with his daughter, Lily. He then looked at the manager of the restaurant, who was standing near the buffet with a look of pure terror. Julian pointed a finger at him and told him he was fired, adding that he should probably practice his kneeling, because he'd be looking for a job in a very different kind of economy tomorrow. As the federal agents reached the stage and placed their hands on Marcus's shoulders, the CEO finally broke. He fell to his knees, the very position he had forced Julian into, and began to sob. He begged for mercy, invoking their childhood, but Julian simply stepped over him. He didn't look back. He walked off the stage with his head held high, the sound of the audience's stunned silence being replaced by a roar of applause that started at the back of the room and swept forward like a tide. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered on a silver platter. The chaos of the gala faded into a hum of quiet, orderly justice. As the flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers pulled away from the Sterling Plaza, the weight that had sat on Julian's chest for 25 years finally lifted. Marcus was gone, his assets seized and his reputation incinerated by the very social media firestorm he had tried to spark. The restaurant manager who had forced Julian to his knees was seen outside the service entrance, clutching a cardboard box of his belongings, staring at the pavement with the vacant look of a man who realized he had hitched his wagon to a falling star. Julian didn't enjoy the sight of their ruin, but he didn't turn away either. He simply inhaled the crisp night air, feeling the cool breeze of a new beginning. Lily's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Freed from the crushing stress of medical debt, Julian moved her into a bright, airy home where the windows overlooked a park instead of an alleyway. He spent his mornings not in a thin waiter's vest, but in a comfortable sweater, drinking coffee and watching his daughter regain the color in her cheeks. He didn't become the same kind of distant, cold CEO that Marcus had been. Instead, he used his majority stake in the company to overhaul the entire corporate culture. Sarah was promoted to a senior executive role, her loyalty and integrity finally rewarded with the power she deserved to wield. Together, they turned the foundation into a beacon of hope for foster children across the country, ensuring that no teenager would ever have to choose between a crime and a future. 5 years later, the sun set over a small community garden in the heart of Chicago. Julian sat on a wooden bench, watching a group of teenagers tend to the rows of vibrant vegetables. A man in a faded orange vest, stained with the dust of the city, walked by with a trash picker and a heavy plastic bag. His gait was slow, and his shoulders were hunched as if he were trying to make himself smaller. It was Marcus. This was his court-ordered community service, a long, humbling road of picking up the very napkins and litter he had once looked down upon. He stopped for a moment, his eyes meeting Julian's. There was no anger left in that gaze, only a deep, hollow exhaustion and the first sprouts of genuine regret. Julian didn't say a word, but he nodded, a simple, human acknowledgement. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, letting it slip, accidentally, onto the grass. He watched as Marcus walked over, picked it up, and instead of pocketing it, ran after a woman who had just dropped her scarf, handing both items back with a quiet, polite word. Julian watched him go, a small smile playing on his lips. The lesson was finally learned. Success isn't measured by the height of your penthouse or the cost of your suit, but by how you treat the people who have nothing to offer you. He looked up at the sky, thinking of the 2 boys on the sagging porch all those years ago. The storm had been long, and the damage had been great, but the sun was finally out. As the narrator's voice would softly remind anyone listening, remember that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind, for the waiter today could be the man who holds your future in his hands tomorrow. Never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes, the most important chapters are the ones that haven't been read yet.